welcome to the panel on blockchain governance. My name is Clara Neppel. I'm from IEEE. For those of you who don't know what IEEE is, we are the world's largest technical association and probably also one of the oldest ones. We were founded more than 130 years ago by Edison and Tesla. And if we think back of what electricity did to us and our society, you can see that there are a lot of advantages. Of course, we all like our washing machines and lightning and blockchain, of course. But it also had some negative consequences. The way the energy and electricity is produced and consumed is one of the biggest discussions of our time related to climate. And if you think also about what kind of governance needed to be put in place in order for electricity to be safe, reliable, as we see today, that it actually works, and inclusive, it also took a lot of governance and regulation to make that happen. And now, coming to blockchain, we have this new technology which has the potential to have equally a very important impact to our lives. And the question is, what kind of governance do we need? We have there also specific governance on the code level, then on the application level, and also, of course, on the regulatory governmental level. And we are very lucky now to have representatives of all these levels here. And I will just briefly name them, and then I will let them introduce themselves. So first of all, we have Eva Kaili from the European Parliament. Then we have Helmut Leopold from the for the Austrian Institute of Technology. We have Ramesh Ramadoss from IEEE, also a serial entrepreneur and a researcher. We have Gustav Arentoft from the MakerDAO, and Ian McGrigg from, well, you're also a veteran and a designer of blockchain technology. So let's start, and as I said, in 2 minutes, if you can just briefly say what you're doing in this context, and I would start with Eva.
First of all, let me thank you for inviting me and being here. I have the chance to work with IEEE some years now, and I really believe that setting global standards is actually necessary for all these emerging technologies, because you have basically engineers that understand how politics should work, and before even politicians understand how they should treat these technologies. So I really think having the consultancy of IEEE has been essential to us, and especially me, because I'm working on legislation. So if I can say something, is that we definitely need to understand it before we try to regulate or legislate around this technology. And it's not easy, because you have to understand how coding works, and what is the cloud, and how blockchain is if you open the computer, to be able to understand that it's neutral, and what we have to do is the governance of it, and to make sure that there will be legal certainty for people to explore all the amazing applications that they could get to benefit citizens and create a new value.
Thank you. Maybe we can go this way.
Okay.
So my name is Helmut Leopold. I'm with AIT. I'm the head of the Center for Digital Safety and Security. And the mandate what we have in this applied research center is dealing with, I would say, information and communication technology, and looking on aspects, how are we able to manage complex technology. So it's about safety issues, how to write and to build safe and reliable systems. It's about cybersecurity. It's about how do we test and verify AI. And it's also, the last 5 years, we spent a lot of effort, how is a technology, a group of different technologies in the context of blockchain, how can this be misused, what are the side effects which are coming up, which are more or less completely the opposite of the promises what the blockchain idea has, and which is then used, of course, by the negative side of the society, to one extent, but also is used by us. And when we not yet understand what the technology, how the technology is harming us, or how we are able to control and manage it, we as a society have a huge problem at the end. And if you ask me then further questions, yes, I can go in more in these details.
Thank you, thank you. So, please.
All right, so my name is Gustav. I work for MakerDAO, so we are the biggest decentralized application right now. We are the market leaders within what's called decentralized finance. So basically, how do you take and automate financial processes with smart contracts? We also the biggest Ethereum project. So we work on like a very, very practical side of things. The outcome of what our technology is capable of is a decentralized stablecoin called DAI, which is quite popular in emerging economies such as Argentina, increasingly in Venezuela, Southeast Asia like Indonesia. I used to live in Argentina myself, so that was kind of like my road into this ecosystem, and kind of like why we need this technology is because I have experienced firsthand how bad it is in these regions, how bad it is in these economies. I used to get paid in pesos. That was not a very fun experience. And this is really, you know, like, for example, like with some of the stuff that Helmut says, is that he knows how much bad this technology is currently doing out in the world. And I'm kind of like a little bit on the other side of things, where I actually see how much good it does, and why we need these decentralized applications, right? Why we need financial services without a centralized authority controlling it.
Ian Grigg. I've been in the space since about 1995, where I started up doing this, what we called financial cryptography in the day. Over the road there was a company called DigiCash that was doing digital cash. Our forte instead was to issue everything except digital cash, and it seemed to me at the time that governance was very important. If you're going to issue something, you should state what it is you're issuing, and you can do that with a technique called the Ricardian contract, which I invented at the time. Moving forward to today, I'm working on the social savings the notion of social savings on blockchain-like artifacts to allow small groups of people to create their own financial scenario and defend themselves against the many threats that exist in developing world countries.
I see more people now. It's a good time to introduce myself. So that's what I was waiting. Ava was saying how standards are important for adoption, right? So I'm actually, as part of IEEE, Clara was introducing about IEEE. I actually oversee the standards, blockchain standards committee under IEEE. So we have like a dozen blockchain standards working groups focusing on different areas like IoT, energy, supply chain, healthcare, and so forth. That's one area. Recently, I was invited to become the convener between Ethereum Foundation and Ethereum Enterprise Alliance to work on a specification for Ethereum 2.0. So it just launched like last week. So that's another thing I'm doing. So those are two things. And of course, I live in Silicon Valley. I have to have a startup. So I have a startup on tokenizing real estate loans.
Thank you. Yes, I think my micro is working, so you can, yeah, perfect. So Eva, I would like to start with you. We heard your talk just a few minutes ago. So now we're talking about governance, and of course regulation is very important. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what regulation do you think we can expect in Europe, and also since blockchain is borderless, how it will be harmonized with the rest of the world?
So yes, the technology cannot be regulated. What you can regulate is the applications, basically. So I would say that what we're trying to do, we did with the first resolution, was to set the principles that we want to work with, and the framework of this legislation, and what we expect, and what are the challenges that we have to face. I think it's important to be based in principles, because if you don't, then you might risk to stop innovation. So for example, when you have GDPR coming, GDPR is there to create legal certainty and to set some standards on how you treat data, but at the same time, when you have these technologies like blockchain and artificial intelligence, if you don't have proper access to data, then basically you might not manage to work enough with good quality of data sets to predict a disease or to protect identities, or to use the best of these technologies. So what we try to do is to find this gold balance regulating properly, but not stopping, blocking innovation to happen. I'm saying that because when I was having a discussion about Uber and how we should regulate Uber, the first response I got, it was very intense from a very passionate young girl, was like, we should block it, we should stop it, we should ban it. And it's like, okay, why? And it was because it doesn't follow the rules.
Not from a taxi company.
So I didn't ask, that's a smart question. No, it seemed to be more like a politician not wanting to understand that smart regulation is really important. So we have to understand the technology and create new sandboxes. So one of the things that we should do and we're trying to do is to see what are the needs and to make sure that people that want to test with this technology, they should be protected also, and they will not face legal problems after they launch an amazing idea that it couldn't work out. It might not work out. It might create some issues. So we have to protect them for them to think out of the box. So I think this is what we have to do, and this is crucial for anything, not just blockchain.
And on the international level, are there any discussions
So
already?
the problem we have in Europe is to harmonize the environment among member states when the member states don't want to allow Europe to centrally control or set the rules. So what we're trying to do for the time being is to have some guidelines and some standards that we would like them to follow. If we achieve that, then it's more easy, like with GDPR. It took us like 4 or 5 years to have GDPR in Europe. We could globally lead by setting the standards to the people that want to work with us or the governments that we want to collaborate. And I say this because for us it's important to protect citizens and their privacy. For some countries it's not. If it's not, it cannot work with our values, then we have to rethink our collaboration. So in terms of working with them, I have been contacted by several governments, and I myself try to travel and talk about these new technologies and see where we can find room and space to work even closer together. There are some governments that they are thinking in a more protectionist, I don't know if that's the word, way. So they don't want to share information, but they want just like to copy some things. And there are governments that they are willing to work with us a bit more and to set common standards. So we try to do that in 2 levels, one inside the European Union and one with our international partners. We have established relations. We have been co-funding pilots. This is a way to do it, so we're testing a bit how we can work together and to see if we can continue or not, but in any case you have to test it to see how and where you can find room to collaborate. So I would say that I can make just a simple example. With the United States, they started by saying everything is a security, or they were very resistant into this technology. After our more positive and open, I think, approach, they came back to us and they tried to remove some decentralized coins from that they are security, from what security means. I think the main argument was, if you don't do it, then companies will go to where it's more friendly for them to develop. So I think we are kind of like positively competing. And with some other countries that they want to have full centralization, like China, maybe it doesn't work very well with blockchain, but maybe we can find some room to work together, for example, in the energy sector or some sectors that it's possible to work.
Yeah. I think China is developing its own blockchain, as far as I know, at least the government. So Helmut, you are very well known for critical questions, and maybe you can elaborate on where you see potential, where this, in the development of the technology and of course on the adoption of the technology.
I'll try to be as clear as possible. So let me spend a few sentences introductory. So the first misconceptions I see, so I appreciate if we have much more discussions on governance, on standards, and on dialogue, not on the technical details, but on the dialogue between technology, use of technology, and building framework of using technology. What we are doing permanently, basically. I think in the that's one of my criticism, number one, a little bit, what I would criticize in this blockchain discussion, that's a little bit misleading. So first of all, the whole day I heard about the blockchain technology. I think that's a wrong term. What we are doing, what we are discussing, what you are discussing here is something what I started nearly 40 years ago already. I did my studies in computer science, so I did formal languages 35 years ago. I did encryption, I made all this stuff. We are using it today, and we just gave a new term around it. So there is no blockchain technology, there is a portfolio of different well-known computer science technologies which we are now applying. And of course, internet technology, computer science is contributing to solving some of our crucial questions on the earth, no doubt. That's what we are doing here. Blockchain is now a strange term putting on top of it, and which is part of the problem that we do this marketing campaign in discussing. We should discuss more serious on the details. So why I'm saying this, just 2 or 3 examples. Number one, let me start with the black side of the moon, with the dark side of the moon. According to studies from Europol, nearly 50% of all B2B transactions of organized crime in the criminal scene is done by virtual currencies. Of course, if you don't have real money, you can now finally you can do what you want and nobody can control you. That's a huge promise for the criminal world. And that's one of the big applications of Bitcoin, for example. So you can buy weapons, drugs, child pornography, everything, and very easily all over the world in a global banking system. Wonderful tool. The law enforcement agencies are completely overwhelmed because it's a complex technology. The solution, but of course, and that's one misconception, number one, there is no anonymity in the blockchain. So for example, we are offering an open source solution to make the financial transactions in virtual currencies, also cross ledgers, so in different virtual currencies, we make them visible again. So that's one of our contribution to the society in this criminal world. So, but that is one side. You can say, okay, that's always that somebody is misusing it. The second, much more bigger problem is the promises what the blockchain idea are really telling to us, from my point of view, looking to our studies when we analyze technology, are not fulfilled. So number one, we believe that we deal with the mistrust and we get rid of centralized functions. I believe in all your blockchains, what you're developing, you're creating new centralized functions again. They are here again. They are just shifted from one central point to another one. One example, in the Bitcoin, in the morning somebody said, everybody can take part and can do. In Bitcoin already, we have the fact that the mining power is within 4 or 3 organizations, and all of them are in China. So I cannot deal with them, I cannot discuss with them, and they will not listen to me, for sure. I have a new central function created. Nobody's discussing this. It happened. We didn't know 3 years ago that this happened. It happened. I have a central enemy now. And I'm a little bit more afraid of 3 central Chinese organizations than the European Central Bank, believe me. That's worrying that there's nobody discussing. If you go further in these subjects, for example, in the private blockchains, you have the same issues. So for example, if you use it for food chain quality assurance, all this stuff, there is no means to check the physical good. So you cannot create trust there. You need again another intermediate, another actor which is checking if you want to have trust. So you get rid of one central function, but we're creating new ones. So far that's fine, it's always when we are using new technology, but we should discuss it. And this discussion is, from my point of view, a little bit missing at the moment, and we should have an eye on this, because at the end, for the private market, I have no problem because the private market will sort out. If there is no solution for a problem, or the solution doesn't solve the problem, the free market will just sort it out, that's fine. If we create some crazy tools like a virtual currency, seamless in the society where no more any central function is controlling it, we have created something and we cannot get rid of it. And this is a little bit strange. Here the question, that's my final argument, where is the responsibility of the technicians? We as computer scientists cannot say we just do what we can do and then we'll see what happens. I think we have some responsibility to think about what we are building and how can we at the end switch it off if it is necessary or change it if it is necessary. And just in this example, this currency, when I take the Bitcoin, nobody can control it anymore. Something happens. Somebody will lose money, somebody will earn money, but it's definitely not fair, and it's not solving our problems of the human society.
So thank you, Helmut, for your
My speech.
yes for your 3 main points, as I understand. Oh, this was my phone. Thank you. Well, I think I will switch directly to Gustav because you were mentioning switching off, and when we discussed about this panel, you mentioned that in MakerDAO there is an emergency stop that you hopefully never use, but it would be interesting to see who would decide on that, how the community is governed, basically.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at like the emergency shut, right, and like Ian and I, we were talking about it just before the panel as well. This is something that as soon as you have like for example like staking models, or you have systems where you can have a majority vote, so you would basically be able to go in and control the entire governance part of the system by obtaining a majority vote. In these systems, it's quite common that you would want something to be able to shut down the system with a minority vote. So let's say that like if someone in Maker accumulates over 50% of the governance token and they start controlling the system, you can with a minority stake in the system go in and basically shut down the system and exclude the bad actors from the reboot of the system. So this is something that you have in some systems. It's quite damaging for the system because it often means that you're actually forking the system. So you have to start over again. But it's something that is meant to be there to keep people in check and also to kind of like remove the price you can put on an attack vector, right? Because if you can calculate exactly how much it would cost you to obtain 51% and there's no way to shut you out after you receive it, then you can calculate exactly how much you would profit off of it, right? And it's not illegal to obtain 51% in a decentralized system. So when you create, I mean, a lot of the systems we see today are a little bit more advanced on the governance side than Bitcoin was. I mean, Bitcoin was something that, I mean, no one could really predict what would happen in these extreme market scenarios, which we have seen Bitcoin be in the recent years specifically, especially when a lot of the public interest has opened up around it. And I don't personally see Bitcoin as, like the prime example of what blockchain technology can be. But at the same time, like as much as you need to have in certain situations these shutdown mechanisms, I think it's also extremely important that no centralized entity will be able to shut it down. Like the way the emergency shutdown works in our system is basically that if you take like a 10% stake, you would send it to like a contract and it would immediately burn your tokens. So you would lose the value that you sent to it, right? In the reboot of the system, people can then, if they believe you did it correctly, they can redistribute your stake back to you. So if you've done it in a correct way, and there's a consensus that this was the right thing to do, then you will receive your tokens back. But if there isn't, then you will lose it, right? So it comes at a pretty high cost, and it's also something that is only to be used, therefore, in situations where it's really, really needed, right? And it's not something that I believe a centralized entity would ever enter into. But the thing is that if you have a company running a blockchain, for example, I mean, even though Facebook say they're not running Libra, I think we've all seen how much they've been grilled by the parliament and different political institutions around the world because they did the opposite thing of what you normally do in blockchain, right? In blockchain, you normally build the product, you launch it, you gain traction, and then all of a sudden the regulators will look at you and be like, oh shit, what's going on here? We need to talk with you guys. But in Libra, they came with the entire roadmap and plan, and they went to the regulators and said, this is what we're gonna do, regulate us. And I know one of your arguments is that, Helmut, that you think that we should have more conversations before we launch this technology, right? We should have an idea of like the conceptions that's gonna like come out of this technology, and sometimes even think like 5 years down the road, like what will be the implications if this happens and this happens and this happens. But as you said, Eva, like there's also something that can highly, pause and like stop innovation, right? And most of these technologies are built by, a very, very small team that dedicate crazy amount of hours of their life, and most often also like a kind of like a spark of like a genius or something, and then they build something that the world has never seen before. And these people neither had the resources or the appearances to be taken serious by regulators. I mean, the project that I work for, we are now becoming a quite respected project, right? But we launched in 2014. I mean, back then, like, no one wanted to talk with us, right? I mean, everyone see you as you're this, like, crazy ambitious project that is never gonna work. I mean, Bitcoin's white paper, never gonna work, right? And then you see 5 years later, all of a sudden now they want to talk, right? But there was no interest in helping to, you know, do anything in the beginning, even in the first few years, right? And there's been none of these white papers that has been released that has been taken seriously, because all projects almost, they released the white papers before they actually build it, right? None of them had anyone reach out to them that said, you know, oh, you should think about this or think about that. So as much as I think it would be like a good idea to have those things in place, I just think it's completely unrealistic to think that, you know, they would even participate in, you know, early startups, crazy ideas.
Thank you. So interesting. So yeah, maybe you're from really the code level, and you're also part of the open source community. Maybe you can discuss about the specific governance model for blockchain projects.
I'd like to start off by asking what we think governance is, and to my mind, governance is protecting the assets that exist. The building of the business is about, you know, creating profit or releasing value or something like that. That's the good technical stuff that people like to talk about. But then there's this governance layer over the top, which takes the success that you've created and it protects the assets for the owners or the people or the community. And with that in mind, the initial conditions of any system, such as a blockchain, but other systems as well, the initial conditions are very important for the evolution or the creation of governance. And in the first 5 years, for example, of the blockchain evolution story, there was very little attention paid to the question of governance. If you like, governance was left out, with various stories and myths and so forth arising. But then 5 years, the second 5 years, there was a fair amount of discussion as to how governance occurs and whether we should build it, and there were attempts to build it properly and so forth, whatever that means. So I'd like to ask, if you like, two questions about that. Let's say that you are going to build a governance system around a blockchain. The first question is, what is the identity of your community? And by that I mean, who are the people that you want to come into this particular community that is then going to be the beneficiary, but also the worker bees, the people that make this happen? Because when you make your governance decisions, when you make your technological decisions, but also very especially your marketing exposure and so forth, you're picking a particular group of people. And that leads on to what happens when things go wrong, because that's when you find out whether you've got it right, whether the community is the people you think they are, whether they have the identity that you imagined in the first place. Leading to the second question, when things go wrong, how do you make a decision? We want to fix things. We want to keep going. We want to do the good thing that we're doing. But when things go wrong, they go wrong because they were unexpected. If we knew what was going to happen, we would have fixed it in the code. We don't know what's going to happen. We didn't fix that in the code, so here we are. Now we need to knuckle down and figure out how to fix it. We need to make a decision. So how do you make a decision? And the canonical example there, the one that everybody talks about, is the DAO in Ethereum. When it collapsed, how did they make the decision to then do a fork, rectify the value, return it to whoever it was supposed to own to, and so forth and so on? And that question is the moment where you discover whether the community that you've built is able to handle that decision-making process. The two work hand in glove. It is very important to know who you're talking about, who you want to bring into your community, and it's very important that you have a decision-making capability in your community at the higher layer above the technology, because when things go wrong, and they do go wrong, you need to figure out how you're going to resolve that. And that's when the real identity of your community shows itself.
Thank you. I think you can keep it. So Ramesh,
Is it on?
yes, can governance be standardized?
Yeah, so governance, right? So when you talk about governance, there could be governance at the blockchain level, consensus protocol, and there's governance at the smart contract level, and there's actually governance at the business level, like who are the stakeholders of that DAO or whatever, right? And then even higher level, you have regulation. Government has to actually, you know, are they okay with the governance model that we built on this whole stack? So there's different levels of governance. Let me give you an example. So you couldn't be building like MakerDAO is built on top of Ethereum. Ethereum is using a different governance model. I mean, they're moving to a different proof of stake. And you're building another governance model on top of a blockchain level governance model. So I think it's quite a complex topic, but talking about standards, ISO has a standards working group focusing on governance. It's still in progress. They haven't published a report yet. And IEEE, we just started a working group focusing on blockchain governance. Actually, as I just told you, it's very complex. There's multiple levels of governance models here, right? You can't really tackle all of them. And this goes back to like, what is the best government, left or right? I mean, all this. So what IEEE is focusing on, at least the working group that we have launched recently, we are just focusing on defining the terms for blockchain. Like, what does this mean? Like, what do you mean by governance? Defining terms, and it's Thomas Cox is actually the chair who is going to be working on this. Both Thomas Cox and Ian Grigg, they both worked on the EOS governance model in the consensus protocol. That's kind of why we have. So Ian worked on the blockchain level. Gustav worked at the smart contract level. So we have people like regulation here, and he's like critical on overall stack, right? So bottom line, we have works in the progress. We just started, the working group. So if anyone is interested, they can talk to us and join the working group. Yeah, it's an individual group.
Thank you. Yes,
I just want
please,
to say just one thing, because I think there's a misunderstanding. We don't expect that blockchain will solve everything. We don't expect that it's the solution for everything or that doesn't have problems. And I think this is a way to start understanding that you cannot be disappointed because you invested in white papers, as you very well said, that they didn't make it. Because where we could be useful would be that we have to verify where the legal base of each company would be to make sure that the team is the team that it says that they claim to be. And to be able to say that they actually they have a degree from the university they say they have, and make sure that there's going to be no fraud, because not all the white papers have a good cause, or they try to actually make a business case. Some of them they try to make money out of this, like the bubble or the hype. So I would say this is like part of the governance, and this would not stop innovation, but it would protect investors, citizens, and the developers themselves from the noise that exists, or from everybody that suddenly is a blockchain expert or blockchain enthusiast. I don't know the definition, but like you can be an enthusiast if you want to be an enthusiast. This doesn't mean you know what blockchain is, and it's very difficult to say that the politicians will understand it, to make sure that the governance will be proper. But we have to test it, we have to be open-minded, we have to have like sandboxes, as I said, funding for that, and definitely you can use blockchain and the decentralization for identity, certification. I can think of many ways. If we say that sensitive data should not be put on blockchain, we should have hashes there, but not sensitive data. So this is like governance, and we're working on that, and I'm very optimistic that it's very useful. Also decentralization and maybe definitions. So if citizens want to understand what's happening, we give them some clear definitions, then they will know and they will properly choose if they want to trust a trusted technology.
Thank you. So I think one of the questions was what I heard as well is about who is accountable if something goes wrong. So who is taking the decision, but also who is accountable, who is liable, because it's a decentralized system. You don't really have one entity that you can address. And the other thing that I also heard is if something on the code level goes wrong, like a smart contract, which is behaving in a way that it shouldn't have behaved, or somebody is trying to misuse it. How do you tackle these problems? So who would like to take these questions? Maybe you, Gustav? Yeah. I think we have.
Yeah. So I mean, like the thing about being held accountable, right? I think that's something that in traditional industries and like traditional societies, you always kind of like have someone you can point to who's like, oh, it's like that guy's fault, or it's that company's fault, or stuff like that. some of the things that happens where you kind of like often will like point out some individual, it's because there's been like some information that's been kept away from the public, right? Or things have been done that weren't supposed to be done. Some of the things that that like some of the blockchain projects try to incorporate, like at the core governance level, is to stay clear of situations where it will be like a single person's fault rather than a community, right? So, for example, in our system, we will be voting on different collateral types we want to have in the system that we will supply credit against. So, for example, if like the community ends up going through the entire governance process with a lot of strict due diligence and ends up taking in this collateral type, but the collateral type then fails, right? I mean, then it's a community-driven decision rather than like a centralized entity's decision, right? If something happens at the code level, I mean, that's probably where like it's the biggest problem, right? Where someone would like abuse or do an exit scam, or someone is hacking the contracts or something, which is what, you know, Ian was referring to earlier with the DAO hack. At that point, that's really where there's someone who's clearly maliciously trying to attack the system. And I mean, they are at fault, right? I mean, at least from the perspective that I have, like if you have open source code that has been audited many, many times, we just completed 3 audits, including a formal verification audit. We have done 2 formal verifications on our smart contracts, which is like one of the highest security standards you can have within software. We've also run open source bug bounties. So if you found a critical bug in our system, we would give you $50,000. This is something you do before you go live with the protocol itself. But even after all of those things happen, I mean, it's still difficult for us to promise that there will never be a bug in the system, right? I mean, there might be a new way for mathematicians to think, or something new that comes up that can be used, right? So, like, it's very difficult to kind of like point towards someone who is at fault there. But one thing that we definitely think that you should stay clearly away from is to, you know, put the fault at like the developers of the protocol, right? Which is something that I know some regulators have like mentioned. It was recently mentioned in a research paper done for the UK government that they think that, you know, people building and developing decentralized protocols should be at fault for mistakes in them, or like should be at fault for the abuse or the usage of them. And I think that's like a very, very wrong direction to take. I mentioned it briefly yesterday during a conversation we had, but in general, the thing with blockchain is that you're responsible for your own money, right? So if you use a protocol and something goes wrong, I mean, of course it really sucks, right? But in the end, like, it's everyone's own responsibility, and I think this is something that's like a little bit new to people also.
I think Ian has maybe
I
a
just want
different...
to comment on that question of liability for developers. It's something that gets people very excited. To frame it, it is not a binary choice. The developers are involved in the process. Now, the question that is placed before us is, should the developer be liable or not? Right now, the developer is not liable at all. The Bank of England, or that research paper, suggested that the liability should fall on the developer, but there was this implied complete liability. So we're switching from zero liability to all liability. It's not that simple. When you go to court, liability is apportioned, it's divided up. Some person might get 10% of the liability, somebody else might get 90%. What we really should be thinking about is, do we want a world where the developer has zero liability? Do we want a world where the developer has 100% liability? Or do we want something in between? And it would seem reasonable that a developer is very involved with the creation of the blockchain software. It would seem reasonable that they should have some comeback on their activities, however that's organized. So let's get away from this notion of strict, utter 0 or 100% and start thinking about how do we bring the developer into the point where they are at least somewhat responsible for their work.
Okay, thank you. We have some other opinions on this
No,
side?
no. It's completely, I like what you said, but just to make it clear, we got rid of a centralized function, and now we have put the coder as the centralized function, and he is now the centralized function, but with no access. You think so, and I agree with this, but the whole society is still, our democracy is built on the pillars that we behave, and that's now the distinction what you said before, that we behave not according to our individual only personal profit. That's not a society. That's maximizing my own profit, even for the cost of the cost for the others. That's not society. That's my individual target. A society, the whole democracy builds in a system that the people in society act in a reasonable way. They think a little bit far more in the future, in the time, in scope. They take into account their neighbors and the others. So the approach that a technician can just implement something and throw it out in the world, I'm not in favor of it. I'm definitely in favor, because then we have a full chaos in the world. I believe so. So that's a little bit only maximizing your startup's profit, whatever then happens in the world. That's not society. And the second approach, I understand, then you have open source and they have a working open source community. You can check everything, that's fine. But the question is, can you guarantee that all for your developments, we have really fair, transparent, looking for the advantage of the whole society on the whole earth, really acting? Or can it happen and suddenly groups will rise, which change their way of their personal governance and policy, and then I have to use it, or I have my responsibility. Hopefully I have a free market at the end. If I'm in China, I will not have, I guess. But then I have some offers and I can choose. If I have not, I'm relying again on another centralized function. Some anonymous people, mainly, which I cannot address. They are doing something, I cannot control them, whatever. So that's not really the
So I would like to give the opportunity.
I want to add a very short thing and then give it to Eva.
Yeah.
She can probably tell who should be liable. But now we are talking. So let's be clear here. All these open source, blockchain, everything is fine. But there are always founders who have stake in the system. There's an economic incentive built in these utility token model. Well, utility security, it's a different argument in the US, but in general, there is a consumptive token that's you need to use the blockchain ecosystem. The idea is they want the blockchain to become big, meaning it's being adopted and an entire ecosystem is built, many dApps built on it. So there's a use for the consumptive token, and then token value goes up, and the founders have stake on it, and they would benefit from it. So the liability should be proportional to the stakeholders in a blockchain stakeholders. In the US, I have a startup, right? So they check, they want me to declare everybody who owns more than 20% of the stake in the company, and they do background check and do all kinds of things, and we are liable. I mean, something goes wrong, people with more than 20% stake in the company is liable. Why not that be applied to blockchain? Somebody could be $1 billion worth on blockchain tokens, and something goes wrong. They're like, it's not my problem, it's your fault. You don't know how to handle the private key.
So, Eva, we have now a discussion on democracy and liabilities.
Okay, so this is a discussion we have constantly about these new technologies. So I will give you just an example of the challenge. So we had artificial intelligence talking about who is liable if an accident happens with an autonomous vehicle, and somebody suggested it's the car. It would be helpful, right? So it's the car that's it. So we had to to basically find the proportional way of talking about liability. It's the car maker, is the software developer, is maybe even the driver. It depends on the case. So we cannot talk in general about liability. I think we have to make sure that there will be clear definition and clear understanding on who is building this blockchain, what are the knowledge and certificates, and where is the legal basis. And if when you cite a white paper and if you agree to that and you invest and the white paper says you have no claim, you can ask for nothing. If it fails, there is nothing you can do. And you go there, then it's your responsibility. So I would say we have to make sure the citizens understand what's happening, to make sure it's clear, and maybe to work case by case and then see if we can set some standards there and make sure that we can identify the liability in a more fair way. But I wouldn't say it's like I would say yes, we achieve disintermediation if we use it this way, but it doesn't happen automatically. It depends. It's the politics you choose to implement this technology that makes it or not decentralized. So I wouldn't say the responsibility of the engineers. I'm an engineer myself. I can build an algorithm. I don't know how you're going to use it. I am not perfect. No, artificial intelligence cannot be perfect because people are asking, you know, the questions and they're providing the data sets. So I would say we have to be realistic and say that there is a benefit there. We can work on some like common definition to harmonize a bit the environment and the legal systems and make sure that people understand that even the central banks fail. We had in Cyprus, and this is the University of Nicosia organizing this event, we had banks sat down, everybody losing anything they had. And we thought it was the government's responsibility and nobody paid anything but the taxpayers. So I think we have to make sure that citizens understand they are responsible about what they trust and try to use it maybe in ways that it would not harm or like cause us like an economic disaster. Because if people are like using it like a gamble and they try to speculate or they trust a team because they want to make money, then we have a shared responsibility also, right? So I would say it depends how we use it. It's a tool. It's like it cannot have a responsibility. We have to see who used it and what the expectations were. But in any case, I'm struggling for several years to say that it's not a tool for terrorists or like black market and buy drugs and buy weapons, because it's already happening without blockchain. It's happening in the dark web. It's happening with cash. You don't need blockchain to do that. You can use blockchain to do that. But I would agree that it's not anonymous. There is always a track. You can always track down who used it and how. So I didn't talk like a lot about anonymity. You can achieve some levels of anonymity, but not really. So in the end, it depends on us how we can make the best out of it. And you already saw that they talk about taxing the currencies, the tokens, and this means there will be liability also for the payment system that use blockchain. You cannot avoid it. But I wouldn't go on the dark or the white side. I would say we have to balance it. The rules about what is legal or not, we know it. And it's not difficult to say. It's just a new technology.
Thank you. I think we have, yes, maybe 5 minutes for questions. If anybody has, yeah, please, over there.
Yes, hi. A quick clarification that I want to ask you, and then I want to ask my actual question. When you talked about liability shared by developers, were you talking about open source projects or projects from private seeking enterprises?
No, so I think like what we're talking about is like if you as a developer create a dApp or like a DEX or something like that, right? Then there has recently been discussions around that the people who created it should be liable for what it's used for.
Got it. Now, the question that I have for you is that there's an argument for no liability that I've heard that I'd like to get your opinion on, and that is that code is speech, and free speech shouldn't be liable legally.
If you're making money out of it, I mean, if you're raising money using an algorithm or code, and you're not, I mean, it should be liable, right? I mean, it's an argument you can have, but to me, it's like somebody is using an algorithm to raise money from the room. If I have an algorithm and I raise money from all of you to do something with it, I mean, am I not liable to you? I raise money from you, right?
But then again, I think that's kind of like going towards a different aspect of which is like fundraising. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about if you create a piece of software that you put on the blockchain, it does action. So for example, let's say that I develop a DEX, right? A decentralized exchange. I put it in, and then all of a sudden security token starts trading on my decentralized exchange. Am I now responsible for committing unlicensed security trading? Am I? I don't think so. I think it's completely ridiculous to say that you can go in and you can regulate that, because then you're basically going and you're regulating intent, right? Did this guy intend to have security tokens trading there? Maybe, maybe not. It's very difficult to say, right? And like, I mean, there's like several applications here where some of these applications, they kind of like swirl in this like gray area, right? And that's, you know, basically that area where regulators would love to go in and, you know, make someone liable for it, because there's trading stuff on it which shouldn't be trading normally without a license or without an approval and stuff like that. And this is where you could go in and, you know, like give people fines or put people to jail, basically.
Thank you. So it's about platforms and liability, a little bit what we have also with Facebook right now. But I think you had...
Just to put on this very interesting question and the discussion, let me put an example on it. I think if the coder is part of a company, and then we have again a kind of product and the company is reliable in our system. So that's solved. I think we're discussing that we have a group of people which are an open source development group, we are doing something. And let us imagine that they build a blockchain. And this blockchain can be used by the user of cars to, just an example, to connect the cars, and they are influencing the way how cars are driving. And now a mistake in the conception of the solution what this open source group developed, I am as a driver was using it, this creates an accident and people are dying. Who is then liable? That's quite an interesting question. Now we have nobody which is responsible. In the AI question, we have still an automotive supplier, potentially, which we can discuss with because he put in the software. But now I was using a function out of the cloud by the society, so the society has to be blamed. And this is a little bit strange now. We have to find answers for it, otherwise it's a little bit strange, isn't it?
Yeah, just on that question of liability, start from the principle of what liability is. Liability exists. If something goes wrong, somebody's going to lose out. Now, how do we decide, where do we get the decision for who gets to lose out? The default in blockchain, of course, is the user is the victim, they lose out, that's it, that's the default. But normally what happens with liability is we go to the courts, and the courts will make a decision for us. So coming back to software, if I were to post a 0-day hack onto the web and claim that was free speech, a court, if it found that 0-day hack was used to shut down a hospital or something like that, would be potentially interested in holding me liable for that. Now, that is, if you like, that is testing the limits of free speech. Free speech is just another doctrine, just another concept, which at the end of the day is found in courts to be a good defense or a bad defense. So liability does exist, and it's a matter of who makes that decision that will eventually determine how it's handled. Developers have a free ride because most of the time they believe they're working on software which is benign. But blockchains are getting close to the level where they're not exactly benign. They can cause harm to other people, and that's where it starts to get very interesting.
It's an interesting discussion as well.
Just one thing, and it's also about intentions. If you have the intention to harm or be benefited and put somebody else in a disadvantage, then you have a liability. So I would say it's a different case for the law. That law has to change and adapt and understand these new technologies. But I think we have some principles there already.
Thank you. It seems that we have time for 2 more questions. So if there are any further questions, we can take them. Oh, please.
You're getting a microphone.
Hello everyone. The question I have is most related with so with blockchain we have pseudonymity, right? And you've touched upon anonymity. How about do KYC, for example, on the blockchain? So you have an identity on the blockchain. What's your opinion on this?
In specific cases, it's definitely needed. We're moving in towards a space now where there will be a larger part of the blockchain activities that will be regulated, because they by default will fall under activities that are traditionally regulated, such as security token offerings and trading securities and stuff like that on the blockchain. To be able to participate in that, you would need to have some kind of like KYC verification tool, right? Either you can use a platform that will KYC you, or potentially you can also use what's called like whitelisted addresses, right? But I think that will be kind of like siloed in like a certain part of the space. The way that we approach these things is that, like, unlike the core protocol itself, you would never impose KYC. because the core protocol is this global unit that just lives everywhere. But what instead you do is you regulate on the edges. So, for example, we have users in more than 100 countries, right? And we work with so many jurisdictions all across the world. But what we need to make sure, and we have 400 partners and projects that uses our technology in one way or another. But we need to make sure that everyone that uses our technology, they will be compliant in their local jurisdiction, so they don't, get in fault and in bad ways. So, KYC in general in blockchain is a big no from our side at least, but there will be certain activities that needs to get regulated like that.
So it depends again on the application. Somebody else who would like to take it?
KYC is one of these funny economic goods which goes unchallenged in the economic world. If banks or authorities start talking about KYC, to them obviously we need it. But it brings in its own problems. So I would ask, what do you want KYC for? And if the answer is to stop crime and criminals, I would challenge that and say, well, actually, KYC is easily bypassed. Criminals will steal documents. They will make up documents, they'll forge documents, they'll buy documents. There's a ready market on the internet to purchase documents. A full set of good KYC documents is about $1,000, €1,000. I've been tracking this for over 10 years. The figure is fairly consistent. Now, if criminals can do this, why do you want KYC? What you're actually doing is keeping honest people honest. And is that a useful goal? I think we've got some discussions there. Why do you want KYC? Think about that.
Interesting. Anyone else? Or
I would just say we definitely need some protection. I wouldn't say what the minimum or the maximum should be, maybe like beyond 10,000, to protect also the consumer. But I agree that it's not something that should block the innovation from happening. But we have to redefine it a bit more, and that's why we're going to have next year a specific regulation for the ICOs and what would be needed to participate, as we did like for crowdfunding. We set the ground a bit there, but we do need to be more specific and understand how the technology works. Because for me, it's important to be able to have everybody participating, to make it easy. But maybe we have to set still some rules.
thank you. Yeah, Ramesh.
I can add a comment. So, I mean, I have a company in the US where we're trying to do security tokens, right? So they want us to do the KYC, AML, and all of that. And, there are companies in the US that are actually doing this, and they have smart contracts, and they try to whitelist, and they put mark on it so that you know who's holding it. And, there's also lockup period, right? I can't transfer it to another person for 12 months, so it's locked. All of these could be done on blockchain, KYC, ML. At the same time, it's like putting identity on the blockchain. At the same time, there are projects that are using blockchain to create identities for people who don't have identities. So you can see, this is why it gets hard to talk about blockchain. There's two ends, always there's two ends to blockchain actually, it's what is right, what is wrong, it depends on what's needed and that, what's the need. So like what, Ian started, which got me thinking is like, hey, in the US, if I'm a director of a company with more than 20% stake in the company, I become liable. I can go to jail, right? If I scam people and I become liable. I have to either sell all my assets. They can take my assets, personal assets, to basically settle the, whatever happens, right? Something went wrong. But he got me thinking, like, why is it not applicable to blockchain where the founders have millions of tokens worth billions of dollars? Why are they not responsible? I mean, of course, the open source developers, they're going to hate for what we say. I'm just thinking, I mean, why is it not that way? I mean, why is it like, then we usually give an answer, oh, it's your fault. You just didn't know how to handle the keys.
Thank you.
I think, again, like there's a big difference between a blockchain or a decentralized application that's running that doesn't have a centralized company behind it, or having something like Tron, where you have like Justin Sun, which is like obviously the beneficiary of it, right? So I mean, again, I do believe that there's definitely some scenarios where you have like a non-decentralized blockchain application where the founders are liable. I don't think you can say that like they're not liable at all. So like I just want, like, I think it's like dangerous to say that like no one in blockchain is liable, because you have actually seen recently, I mean, so I think it was ridiculously low, right? But EOS, they got like a small dash on the hand for conducting an unlicensed security sale in the US. And that went to like some people, right? So, you know, like, it's not because it's completely, I just want to make sure that we're clear about that. It's not that there's no liability in blockchain. There's a lot of liability, and there are actually people that you can call in a lot of situations. With Bitcoin, there aren't, and that's what people usually take as the standard of the discussion, right?
So I think we are giving an action item to Eva to work on the legal framework to find people who are responsible. Huh?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's not only if, I think it looks like we need more discussion on that, because it has a lot of facets, and we saw there are already some things in place, but we definitely need to continue this discussion. Thank you very much for a very interesting panel, and see you next time. Thank you.